Welcome to the Futurati podcast. Any member of the Futurati is somebody who believes in the power of the future. We know there's a better world ahead, and we indeed have the power to make it so. In our podcast, we talk to the best minds in the world about the most urgent problems facing mankind today, and we hope you learn as much from them as we do. I'm Thomas Fry, a professional futurist and keynote speaker.
And I'm Trent Fowler, a machine learning engineer and author. Thank you for joining us. Today we are joined by Jarred Bultema, who is a machine learning engineer and data scientist at DataRobot. So, Jarred, why don't you start off by just giving us as long an introduction to yourself as you want to. I know that you were formerly in bioinformatics, I think, and now you're in data science. You have a PhD, so there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about there. Why don't you tell us how you ended up where you are today?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. I have an interesting journey because even within the life sciences, my focus wasn't really on kind of data-driven projects. So my background is in biochemistry and really kind of cellular machinery. So, how do you accomplish certain things within the cell, and what are the kind of molecular players that work together to build sort of, engines and things like that. And then I went on from that and did a postdoc in immunology on therapeutic vaccine development. And then after that was actually a professor of biochemistry where I led a research group doing vaccine development. So lots of bioengineering, cell culture, cell manipulation, genetic engineering, things like that. But it was really interesting because the timeline for an individual execution of an experiment was often weeks, right? So if I wanted to do one experiment within cells, that took days to grow the cells, 7 to 10 days for the treatment period of my experiment, and then some readout time. And so it would be kind of weeks before I found out an answer. And so as I was kind of getting fatigued of the academic life and what I wanted to do, kind of transitioning away from being a professor and doing something else, I found it wasn't really to my liking. I started getting more interested in AI analytics, things like that. Part of the motivation for that was my spouse, who we actually have the same graduate degree, but we're on polar opposite ends of things. And she was doing kind of data science on living systems in her PhD. She had made a transition into data science a little bit before me, and I kind of peeked over her shoulder as she was doing with it, as she was kind of doing data science, working in the new profession. And I found that it solved my biggest frustration with traditional science, which was that long experiment time, where it's weeks to know the answer if something worked. And there's lots of, places along the path for that to go wrong. And within data science, you just compress that time frame exponentially, where it's, hours to maybe days to have the answer to an experiment. And so kind of seeing that pace and then kind of dipping some toes into the fundamental, skills and techniques you need to do data science, decided to just take the plunge, dive all the way in, and then worked as a consultant, went through a bootcamp program, and then was hired at DataRobot as a data scientist.
Nice. Which bootcamp program did you go through?
I went through the Galvanized Data Science Immersive.
Oh, that's right.
It was in person at the time and is now a remote-only thing, as are almost all things in the times of COVID.
Yeah, so I went through the same program. What was your capstone project, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, so I actually did sales demand forecasting. So I partnered with a company, got some of their retail sales data, and then did all three of my projects on that forecasting. And that really kind of kicked off an interest and obsession with forecasting and how to do it better, because, as generally happens when you dive into a new type of project, you're really unsatisfied with the results. And then kind of, part of the discovery is what could I have done better? And part of the discovery is, well, what are the tools that you use to do this well? And so it's kind of kicked off this fun continual learning process.
So you could actually then go in and analyze retail stores today and determine kind of their likelihood of failure over the coming months?
Yeah, you have lots of kind of various granularity that you can get insight into stores. I'd say at the most granular level is predicting how much sales or demand for sales are you going to have for every item at every store across like large multinational retailers. So kind of forecasting hundreds of thousands of items. And that's really like at the most granular level. And then you can think about that aggregating up to pretty much any level you want, all the way out to, kind of financial decisions. Is this a wise investment to put money, here or there?
That's real interesting. I wrote a paper a while back on this concept of when do we reach peak e-commerce. And it has to do with the idea that we can never reach 100% e-commerce, because that means we would have no coffee shops, we'd have no restaurants to go to, and so we'll never go that far. And so when do we reach peak e-commerce? Because we're only slightly above 10% at the moment. And then how long does it take to reach peak e-commerce? And so it becomes kind of a philosophical endpoint somewhere along the way there.
Does 10%,
yeah, so what
does 10% e-commerce mean that
what did you come up with as a rough estimate?
What my basic guesstimate for this was around 10 years from now, and that we would probably peak out at around 20%. We still have a need to get out and be around other people, and I don't think that goes away. And so buying things, we no longer are entertained by just looking at products on a store shelf. And so we want something that's much more interesting, much more engaging, and have that experience that goes along with it. And so I think we have a whole new breed of storefront that comes out of the woodwork, and we're already starting to see a lot more things, like the trampoline parks for kids, and the immersion tanks, full sensory immersion tanks, and yoga studios and karate studios and things like that are less about coming home with bags full of stuff and more about gaining an experience. And so I think we continue to go down that path, making that transition.
It's interesting if you reflect on strip malls and kind of the turnover of what's the composition of many strip malls. They go from this kind of small scale, atypical retail, and they turn over into, as you're describing, kind of activity-based retail, right? And you see like gyms popping up, and there's trampoline parks, they're replacing big box stores. And I think you're right. It's kind of what can you get rid of in terms of uninteresting aspects of your purchasing. And then it's the things that are fun to buy, and it's the experience, or the things that only have value seen in person. I think the death of small retail and the growth of e-commerce is probably the shift toward larger and larger players, though. I think that's one probably downside of that transition. Well,
yeah, there is that. As much as we tried to have stuff delivered during the COVID crisis, we found that if we have fruits and vegetables delivered, they seem to pick the stuff on the bottom of the barrel to give us. So it's less than appealing. So we still really like to go to the store to pick out certain items. It's the same with clothing stores. You want to really feel the fabric, and shoe stores, you really want to feel how it feels on your foot, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so some of those are interesting, because a few years ago I would have completely agreed with you on the last point, but now I think the ease of returns has, at least for me, has offset part of that. So, fresh fruits, yeah, absolutely, I'd like to pick my own. But shoes and other things, often I'll buy, one or multiple pairs and then return the ones I don't like. And so, there's a minor hassle in swinging by the post office to drop off a package, but it kind of offsets the shoe shopping in store. So I think of the pairs of shoes I bought, probably 80% of the most recent ones I purchased online.
Yeah, so I think the deeper question is, what exactly is it that you're purchasing when you spend money at an establishment? And Thomas is right that feeling the fabric is an important part of it, but I think that is offset by the ease of returns today. The things that I don't think will go away are probably going to a concert or going to a coffee shop. I think those have a certain amount of staying power, because you can currently stream the ambient noise of a coffee shop over YouTube, but it's just not the same. It doesn't smell the same. It's not the same as seeing the people around. Plus, there's just this coffee shop vibe that for some people helps them work or have thoughts they otherwise wouldn't be able to have. So I think the things that will continue to be around are the things that aren't really about the money or the fabric, or it's the process of doing it that is its own reward.
So in your way of thinking, is there a way of modeling what works and what doesn't? And in that, I think that's the question that a lot of people have in their minds. Is there a smarter way to go about analyzing what business models are going to work in the future?
Oh, what an interesting question. Yeah. I think with all things, it comes down to data and availability of the kind of types of data you need. I think, that's, I think, one of the lessons I have learned getting deeper and deeper into data science and working on more diverse use cases is that, ultimately your limitation is going to be in the data. And for a problem like that, you'd need to harvest lots of data from small retail and the descriptions of that. So one can kind of imagine piecing together a, substantial data set that includes things, as kind of granular and boring as their kind of financial status and transactions, but then, whatever info you could scrape on the business type and traffic from Yelp or Foursquare or anything like that.
Do topic modeling or sentiment analysis on reports that customers provide as to the experience or the reason they actually got into it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
I think that's kind of the human version of online reviews.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I guess it's the same thing. You could just scrape it as well. From Yelp, the data sets exist for that kind of thing already.
So let me give you a scenario here and see if you could describe how you would model some sort of an analysis for this. So this would be a new feature on a smartphone, and it's a feature that I call the point and call and the point and text feature. That there's been so many times when I've driven by a store and I just want to be able to point my phone at the store and to be able to call it, just hit a button and call it, and then find out if they carry this particular product. Or I'm driving down the road and the car next to me is irritating me. I want to send them a text to tell them how much they're irritating me. So this idea of having a point and call or a point and text feature on a phone, there's all kinds of ways that this can go wrong. I mean, if you go to a party and you send a text to a good-looking girl or something, you probably get slapped or something along the way. So, I mean, how do you test out these type of features in advance to actually building it? I mean, is there a way to model the acceptability of something like that?
It kind of depends, right? So is there previous data on a similar thing that you can use for extrapolation? And so there's that's always the challenge of kind of a cold start problem, right? It's a new feature, it's a new product, and there's no data on it. How much can you borrow from existing data on similar things and then apply, put your thumb on the scale for some assumptions that you're going to bake in and get performance out? So it's definitely doable, but it's from my perspective, that ends up becoming a hybrid of machine learning and more traditional statistical modeling, where, right, some component of that problem you're going to model with, classical machine learning algorithms for kind of whatever type of use case. So, when it's forecasting the sales, there's a bunch of approaches you could take, and we can definitely go down that avenue if you want. And then on what are the new features for a store, and what's this new thing? Are there things you can borrow from? Do you have to manufacture synthetic features or synthetic relationships and kind of define those mathematically? And what do you feed in as known parameters? What are you going to have as internally optimized parameters by kind of whatever loss function you're using? So you can take those hybrid approaches and then merge the two. And so, use the mathematical rigor of machine learning where it's appropriate, and then use human intuition as much as you can with whatever data is available and kind of merge the two in the middle.
Okay. So there's still a lot of guesswork then.
Yeah. one component is if it's net new, right? So if it's, if the scenario, it depends how groundbreaking is that feature. What you described is a pretty novel feature that doesn't exist yet, right? But if it's, kind of a minor extrapolation of an existing thing, if it's quite close to it, you can kind of figure out how do you want to kind of encode this novelty and feed it into existing training data sets, see if it has some value. But, ultimately, if there's nothing known about the thing that you're trying to predict and you can't find data that represents it, then you're left making up the equations yourself.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Right. One of the things that I've learned in the years since I've been a machine learning engineer, and specifically since I graduated the Galvanized program, is that machine learning, it's just math all the way down. There's nothing magic about it. And I think in the common imagination, it's almost mythical the way these things work. But if you apply a linear regression to a data set, there's just an equation that's being solved for. They're just drawing a line of best fit by minimizing a cost function with gradient descent. Or the same for K and N, K-means. These are just equations that you apply to a data set. And if you don't have good data, or if it's a completely novel thing, there's often just no answer machine learning can provide you.
Yeah, so I was speculating that this could be a feature that can go off the deep end and violate a lot of privacy and get a lot of people complaining about it, or it could be a very useful feature depending on kind of the framing of how it's used and everything. So anyway, I was thinking that it'd be helpful if there's some way to quantify or qualify the ideas before we go too far down the road and try to develop them.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? That's kind of like the boundary between AI ethics and human ethics. And so, I think the internet and the anonymity of the internet has shown that if you give people the power to interact with other people in an anonymous way, it doesn't always go super well. And so, like, the greater and greater degree that AI lets you penetrate with people or kind of interact with people like that in a closer to face-to-face way, I think kind of probably starts breeding some of the same challenges you have with, like, you wouldn't do this thing if you were right in front of the other person. But with enough of the veneer of kind of social media or the internet between you, you might do it. So, how many steps back from actually saying that to the person do you have to have before you kind of have that boundaries between, what is someone's individual ethics start changing? And then on the flip side, once you also then have the permanence, that kind of everyday interactions in real life that you have with online personas and, posting something online, it never really disappears. So how much do you start baking that into everyday life? So kind of finding those two meeting in the middle, and then what's the ethics and social norms that govern that kind of new boundary space between the true physical space and the whatever digital interactive space exists.
Yeah, great explanation there. Thanks.
Do you have any thoughts for how to concretize the mediated experiences we have over the internet such that people take them more seriously? Because you're absolutely right. I find myself often tempted to say things on Facebook that I would just never say to a flesh and blood person in front of me. And I think it's the distance and the fact that you don't have to look into a person's eyes and say this to them that makes it so much easier to do. And to date, I haven't really indulged that, but it's nevertheless something that tempts me when I'm interacting in these media. Do you think there's any way to walk that back a little bit without losing the benefits we get from social media?
I don't know. In one sense, you kind of, I think, and I even said this, but I think, back in the chat room days when everyone was kind of username based, I think that there was this anonymity. But something that's been interesting on a bunch of social media platforms is like the true name accounts, like Twitter, Checkmark, or, people using their real name on Facebook. That kind of removes that anonymity, and still, it's like, okay, now you know who the person is. Their name. Are they a person that's in front of you that you interact with, and so you have any sort of empathy with, or are they just kind of, indistinguishable to you from some avatar? Man, I don't know. I think I'm quite concerned about the impact that social media has on human kind of social interactions because of what we've seen in, social media use in the past 10 years and kind of the power it has in all sorts of ways, from kind of teens and memes and organized effort of rebellious teens to organized propaganda efforts, more kind of like political and social isolation and extremism of ideology and echo chambers. I hope there's ways to walk it back, but the ways that I keep thinking are going to put some reins on it don't end up slowing down the process. So I'm obviously not good at predicting what's going to be effective for social media and kind of online ethics.
Yeah. A while back, a British psychologist by the name of Robin Dunbar came up with what people have referred to as the Dunbar number, of how many people do we have strong relationships with in our life. And typically that number comes in around 150, although some people think it's higher than that or lower than that. But these are the number of people that you might go out and have a beer with, or you have dinner with, that you're closely interacting with in lots of different ways. Now, since social media came out, these strong relationships have been replaced to the large part by weak relationships, and in a lot of cases, even tangential relationships. Like on Twitter, if you have 250,000 followers on Twitter, you don't have much of an intimate relationship with any one of them. And so it has blurred the lines of kind of the way we form relationships with other people, and the channels for communication. All of those have changed considerably over the past few years, and it raises, in my mind, it raises all kinds of questions, naturally, about the ethics of everything, and how damaging this is to our human kind of need to relate to other people. But it may give us more capabilities on the other hand too, and so we're much more aware of things happening in our families and to people on the other side of the world than we ever were in the past. So I think there's pluses and minuses that kind of counterbalance each other. I'm not sure there's a good way of modeling that yet in a way that is meaningful to tell us when we've gone off the deep end.
So I think there's an interesting example and kind of sample into humanity that has reached that deep end. And it's like, as you described, these people who have massive social media followers. So, hundreds of thousands, millions of, Twitter connections, the big YouTubers, and people for whom, like, there's been a shift from individual interactions, or at least kind of just like extended individual interactions, to numbers, right? Like how many likes, how many views, how many retweets did this content, this thing I did produce. And, I think that's kind of the extreme example where we can see they have the ability to get the data perspective on their both professional and social lives. And, they're kind of at the deep end. And so I think there's kind of notorious anxiety and depression among these kind of large influencers because of this kind of constant new pressure and, kind of the ultimate keeping up, algorithmic driven, keeping up with the Joneses to remain popular. And so I think that's kind of the closest we're seeing to that degree of merging of the two. And it's kind of fascinating and scary and, also really interesting as a problem to solve. Like, how much could you, given current status, how much could you predict these human interactions and these aspects of kind of a human life to some degree, or kind of societal or group behavior? So
with your background, and there's just lots of interesting emerging technology kind of coming out of the woodwork. What's your dream job? I mean, what gets you up in the morning? What would get you really excited about going to work?
Yeah, I really love solving problems. And so that, there's certain areas that I'm particularly fascinated by, or at least have been in the past, but just that problem solving process is just so much fun. And then kind of finding a way to make that somewhat repeatable is just a kind of enjoyable thing for me. It gives some sort of dopamine release and scratches some sort of itch. But I think I love the opportunity to see science at human scale and doing it fast. So that's one fun thing, is kind of blending AI, data science, machine learning on traditional scientific problems kind of as they meet humanity. So, certainly vaccines, and just more and more data on vaccines, and starting to be able to mix together kind of molecular data you might have, but also all this kind of human data, and blending all of those together, and kind of seeing what are the new frontiers that you can do once you have all those disparate sources of data. Kind of what problems can you solve when you know all this stuff? I think those types of problems are most interesting to me, and especially when there's some sort of tangible, a tangible benefit associated with solving a problem, right? So that's kind of the second aspect, is I like to do things that like lead to something. Discovery is fun, but not the most fun for me if it's just the sake of discovery.
Yeah, so I wanted to circle back around to some of the comments you made as you were introducing yourself, and in particular dig into this question of automated science and the interface of machine learning and science. So there are a couple different angles from which we could approach this. On the one hand, we could talk about how these massive data sets are enabling all sorts of insights that weren't possible in the past. We could also talk about how various teams of roboticists and artificial intelligence engineers are building true robot scientists, right? So you work for a company called DataRobot, but there was also that team in Wales that built Atom, which was essentially just an automated experimental facility that downloaded all this information on yeast genetics and discovered these yeast genes that had never been discovered before, and humans were basically not involved at all. There was another algorithm that took massive amounts of physics data and was able to rededuce the Newton's 3 laws of motion from basically just that over the course of an afternoon. So there's really this fascinating field emerging of automated science, and I wondered if you could speak a little bit to that, given that you are a data scientist and a trained scientist.
Yeah. It's been really interesting because I think a lot of the automation came to science early on, in part because, scientists will pay tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars for automated machinery. So I think kind of like manufacturing and science, you actually saw these early steps in automation. And then, they also had very repeatable processes. So I was kind of, when I was being trained as as kind of a laboratory scientist, my undergrad and my PhD, it was just on the cusp of automation becoming relatively normalized. And so rather than, moving fluids between two tubes with, a pipette yourself and kind of being a human pipetting robot going back and forth and mixing things, you started seeing robotics to do that. And that ended up being a huge change in how you could do kind of that scale of science and a lot of that type of science, because you could now, automate things to do hundreds of, various pieces of an experiment kind of in one run. And that just isn't feasible with a person doing the work. And that's true across all sorts of places. So you have that kind of physical automation. And then as you're discussing, even kind of on the genetic side, starting to get automation of genetic insights and analysis. Kind of there were early predictive tools in some of the scientific software, and certainly, scientists are smart and generally connected to math departments. And so whenever they had data, they would be trying to find ways to, find some useful publishable fact from it. And so it's really interesting to kind of see that transition and see how powerful it was, and how there's still place to be a scientist around the automation, and like, what are the things you're automating? And then seeing that transition within data science has been really interesting as well, and kind of seeing that it's actually lagged behind what kind of was happening in physical sciences was a bit of a surprise to me. But that's been fun to see as well, of kind of how much can you apply those same automation principles toward the things you do in data science, and how much does that change kind of how your job is performed, or to your previous comment before, like, does it automate your job away? And kind of seeing what is the reality of that has been pretty interesting.
Yeah, a few years back, the CEO of Foxconn, one of the largest companies in the world, the CEO said that he was going to replace 500,000 workers with 500,000 robots. And as we've learned along the way, it's never a one-to-one replacement. And so these are fun things to make headlines and on blog posts and newspapers, that sort of thing. But the reality is much messier than that. It's much more blurry. So kind of the state of automation today, I mean, is there a way of quantifying the ratio of human replacement with automation? Is that something that could actually get a number for that?
You know, I have seen some numbers. I definitely am not an expert in kind of that avenue, but there's, you know, as you say, a human component to automation. Certainly there's some kind of use cases for automation that are probably neutral to humans, where it's kind of augmenting their capacity or doing something that a human wasn't really touching that doesn't impact kind of the human labor on it. But there are many, many kind of interaction points between what's capable with automation and what humans are doing. And ultimately, on a lot of those, when you bring in automation, you're displacing humans. So there's definitely some studies on that. And, you know, I don't recall off the top of my head. I want to say it was in the neighborhood of 40% was kind of the estimate. And it was interesting seeing the diversity of things that are automatable, right? Because, you know, some things are just really challenging. The more things you're asking an automated system to be able to do, the more difficult it's going to be to do it. So, you know, Tesla notoriously built this huge automated manufacturing line for one of their models, and then it was kind of plagued with problems, and they ended up spinning up a human, kind of human-run automobile manufacturing line in the parking lot to kind of augment and replace this automated line that they weren't really able to get the kinks all worked out of. But, you know that sometime down the road, that automated line is going to be working if they continue to kind of invest the money to get it there. And what's that swing going to be? Kind of how many tens or hundreds or thousands of workers do things like that displace? And it's a really, you know, it varies across use cases, but there is that harsh reality that's easy to not think about. It's easy to just think about, here's the data, here's the problem to solve, and kind of dehumanize what the problem is actually working on.
I think it's hilarious. Virtually every construction site I go through along the highway, there's always a guy holding the slow sign. And I always find that to be the most obvious example of something that could get automated out of existence. But I think somehow it's written into contracts that you have to have a guy holding a slow sign at every highway construction project.
And he always has to do the hand motion to tell you to slow down as you drive past him, because you're never going slow enough.
Yeah.
And I think there are some interesting observations to be made about exactly what will end up being automatable in the near future. And it's often not the things people think that it will be. And the people who think that their jobs are safe are often the ones that are going to either be outsourced to a different country or outsourced to an algorithm in relatively short order. And this harkens to a sort of deeper mystery within the field of artificial intelligence. And in 1953, when they had the Dartmouth Artificial Intelligence Conference, where the term AI was coined, it was estimated that a dozen scientists working for half a year would be able to build an AI system that could do everything a human could do. And 70-something years later, we're not even close to that. And part of the wrinkle came from the fact that the things we thought would be easy to solve, like doing calculus or string theory, wound up being reducible to figuring out a mathematical way of expressing that and feeding it to a computer. And you've got all sorts of automated theorem provers. The things that wound up being very difficult were the things that we take for granted. So navigating an obstacle course or effectively working a hammer. And my hypothesis is that this is driven by the fact that human introspection is very shallow. And we have a lot of introspective access to what goes on when we do calculus, because that's something that we have to learn deliberately. But the process of walking up the stairs or catching a ball or juggling, this is not something that we have introspective access to. Most of those skills came from when we were, younger, and we don't know anything about how the brain goes about coordinating muscular contractions to catch a ball. That's just not something we can introspect directly. And so it wound up being very difficult to build algorithms to do those things. And so ironically, many of the jobs that I think will be safe for a long time are the people who are building your deck, are installing the roundabout that you were telling us about before we started recording, and doing similar sorts of blue-collar jobs. I think they're going to be safe for a while.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So there's some things that, there's such a variety of individual, nimble challenging things to do, and so many small decisions that we are terrible at introspecting on. And we're also overly confident about everything we're doing. I think that's kind of the human trait in general, is to be overly confident about how easy something will be. At least that's kind of been a takeaway message for many things in my life, is, oh, that won't be too bad, only to find it not go that way. And then the other aspect is, what's the cost to develop that thing? Because that's something that, I kind of, from all ends of the spectrum, I can certainly speak to the AI side, but I can only imagine on the complexity of kind of actual physical robotics. A lot of these things end up being more challenging than you would think to get to kind of a finished point. And so it's always this question of, well, do you want human level performance? Do you want superhuman performance? And, where kind of the algorithm of the machine is going to do better than a human? And how much kind of marginal value do you want to squeeze out, all of that last performance versus kind of what you're going to get relatively quickly? How much juice do you need from that squeeze? And, I think that's certainly right now, at least, it's still more difficult than we would expect. But, who knows, as we apply more automated approaches, and especially kind of evolutionary approaches that you hinted at before, of kind of solving things in a way that we don't have to define, it's interesting, but ultimately it comes down to time and training data, right? We're like a biological neural net that's had, 20 to 50 years to train on, a constant stream of data. And so you have to find, depending on what you want to train, you have to find a way to kind of fire hose that data if you want it to train fast and be effective.
Yeah, I'm always suspect of these exponential growth curves that don't account for the kind of the big variables. As an example, Dennis Gabor is the guy that came up with holography back in the late 1940s, and he invented the concept of holography, and he worked out a lot of the math and the details surrounding it. And it's this idea of getting to a three-dimensional display. I mean, how do we get to a point where we can actually display something three-dimensionally? I mean, we all know what it looks like to see something, a screen above our computer, but if we throw the screen away and display things three-dimensionally, we're really bad at understanding what that's going to look like. We've been raised with two-dimensional books and two-dimensional whiteboards and blackboards, and even the screens on our computers are two-dimensional. So even though we live in a three-dimensional world, it's very hard for us to imagine what it would look like to surf the internet three-dimensionally. Or if you have three-dimensional charts and graph, what does that third dimension represent? And so this idea of holography, a three-dimensional display, we've projected out that this is going to happen by a certain date many times over the years, and it's we kind of get there and we kind of improve it a little bit and a little bit and a little bit, but we've underestimated the size of the challenges along the way, and so it's. So when we put together these growth charts that exponentially this is going to happen, we miss out on some of the really difficult problems that we have to cross along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of curves that look exponential until they start flattening off, right? So if you're early on in kind of an exponential curve, you don't know if it's going to end up being something sigmoidal or what's going to happen. All you've seen is kind of the ramp up. And it does definitely set these kind of false expectations, and especially if we don't learn from other things, right? As humans, we're pretty bad at seeing like, there's lots of these things that go up and then they pop, right? So like bubbles bursting or all sorts of phenomenon where we don't really think about the negative consequences and we don't learn from the other situations, and kind of over optimism about it'll never go down, and yeah. That's a fascinating topic.
I think that makes sense evolutionarily as well. So in the EEA, the Environment of Evolutionary Adaptability, there were very few exponential processes. I mean, almost everything is linear. And so you can forecast almost everything in your environment by just adding one to it in perpetuity and just trying to imagine what that would be like. Today, that's much less the case. And I think that we are up against some of the limits of human cognition in terms of trying to solve these problems and trying to look ahead to the future. And to stay with this idea of automation, so you work at a DataRobot, which is an ML ops company and an auto ML company. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about ML operations and what that means relative to a person like myself who's just a machine learning engineer. How's that different, and what differentiates DataRobot?
Sure. Yeah, so I think the whole idea is thinking holistically about what is the path between data and getting some sort of value from the data, right? And so that's kind of the ultimate idea is kind of anyone who's not a data scientist, their concern is, okay, how is this thing useful? So it's cool that we have all this information, but what can we, do, or how can we change using this information that we wouldn't otherwise kind of know to do? And that's where MLOps comes in. It's kind of that last step of how do you take kind of the solution that you've created via data science and machine learning, how do you turn that into something that's actionable and something that continues to be actionable in the future? And is not just kind of the equivalent of an ad hoc once and done analysis that doesn't continue to function into the future and adapt as kind of the underlying situation that it's kind of trying to predict is changing. So it's, I was definitely naive to a lot of the machine learning operations aspects until I was actually trying to kind of think about real business use cases and seeing the challenges that business have actually pushing those use cases into production. And largely it's a different skill set, which is kind of a surprise to everyone who's not a data scientist who would do that. People kind of find out that there's no obvious owner for the skills that are required to take a model out of development and into the situation where it's continuously providing value because it's integrated into some system and it has all sorts of kind of monitoring and alerts and ability to fix it so that it's not kind of like, you build a car, it rolls off the manufacturing line, and then there's zero support for that car. There's no one who knows who's responsible for, changing the oil or fixing a flat tire or anything like that. It's just the idea of like, hey, I built a car, and the rest is up to you.
So part of the way I think about this is ML ops is to machine learning as software engineering is to just writing code as a hobby. So you've got some really talented, really sophisticated people that build these hobby projects, but there's really a pretty large gap between doing that, writing a few thousand lines to do whatever, track your diet, and then producing an app that has a Docker container where it can deploy across platforms, where it can be audited, where security logs are being kept so that you can go back and find out why something failed, where you can open it up and say, this is what this line is doing, this is what this line is doing for compliance purposes. Machine learning in many ways, I think, is stuck where software engineering was in the 90s, where there's nobody doing that. There's nobody doing continuous integration or continuous development, or if they are, it's just sort of cobbled together. There's not a generalized sense of these other tasks being very important. I think a lot of people who get into machine learning are just, they like computers and they like math, and this is kind of a way for them to do both those things. And there's really a lot more to it if you want your models to continuously provide value, be safe, be auditable, and run for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you kind of think about, what's the real life impact of this? So, the largest banks in the world are using machine learning to power a lot of their kind of internal decisions. And when you think that there's billions on the line, are they going to trust a system? Kind of what does it take for them to be willing to bet millions or billions on the functioning of the system through all kind of the software aspects you described? And then, that's the challenge, is it has all of that software complexity. And then there's still this ongoing data science problem of, is my model performing well? Is it accurately reflecting what the recent future is, or kind of the underlying data that it assumes is going to remain constant to make all these predictions that we're automating and then kind of have billions in liability on? So you have to track all of that as well. So it's all the software side to harden something from a janky kind of science project into a billion-dollar trusted kind of production-grade entity, and then also having the data science to make sure that this nice thing we built is going to continue to function accurately. And that, you know, there isn't some sort of a change where now all cars have 3 wheels and you built a 4-wheeled car, right? Or some kind of whatever scenario you can imagine. There's actually a great one when it comes to lending, where there's just some point where they changed the number of loan grades and subgrades available. They just got rid of one loan grade. And so kind of a human knows this, right? If they check the news, they see, hey, this loan grade is no longer available. And so that's going to force all the people that were in that grade somewhere else. But if you don't have if you haven't built that new change in, your models never learn that there's no longer that as a possible option, and that, you know, the data has shifted as a result. And so it keeps making these assumptions based on the historic kind of scenario, and your accuracy starts going kind of wild if it's this important feature. And so unless you're tracking kind of what does the distribution of every single one of my features look like, and the average value and all sorts of things like that, you risk having this drift in your data or large external factors that kind of break your billion-dollar engine, and then, you know, you might have substantial liability. So it's kind of, how can you get all of that plus the kind of convenience so that when your stuff breaks at 2 a.m. in the night, you're not reliant on, you know, Jerry to go fix this thing. There's some way that this comes back online fast so that it's not, you know, however many millions of dollars are lost because of downtime. So it's kind of this area where, like, you know, the science project of data science meets the business impact that you can have.
Right. It goes back to what I said earlier, that machine learning, it's not magic. It's just math all the way down. And if you don't tell it that there is now no longer this credit class, it's not going to discover that. It's just going to keep churning out the exact same things, and your accuracy will go wild. Yeah.
So this is maybe an odd question, but how does the emerging field of quantum computing change machine learning, and how does it change kind of the way you think about things?
Oh man, that's a really good question. I definitely confess I'm not as, like, I kind of have the basic knowledge of quantum computing and the types of problems you solve with quantum computing, and to certain kind of stronger in the quantum chemistry, quantum physics side than the potential machine learning applications. But my understanding is it's these kind of types of problems where it's extremely difficult to resolve the state of something. And, you know, ultimately it's math all the way down for machine learning. So it's this kind of binary, you know, it's thing A or it's thing B, and then you can build systems on top of that. But those are really bad at dealing with circumstances where, you know, you can't test through a bunch of variants to see what it is. It's kind of simultaneously occupying this certain state, and you can kind of have this weird kind of probability bubbles up through quantum computing. But I think, you know, it's hard to know at this point. It might be something that's really revolutionary in the types of problems we can solve, because, you know, that the ability to solve those certain types of problems might have really profound impacts on kind of human life and society and, you know, the advancement of science and technology, or it might end up being a relatively small kind of new tool in the toolkit. I honestly don't know where it sits right now. There's definitely all sorts of really amazing, fascinating kind of techniques within science that have unbelievable physics that kind of allow them to be possible. And then it's not always the impact of them is not always the same as kind of the amazing, how cool it is you can do the thing.
Yeah, my own thought is, if anything, I'm far more of an amateur than either of you, but it will largely boil down to what are the sorts of problems where a quantum mechanical approach will prove useful. So I think if people don't know much about quantum computing, they're just going to assume that it will break everything will change. Well, not necessarily, because there are many problems for which a classical algorithm does as well or better and for far less cost. So if it turns out that personalized medicine becomes easier, material science becomes easier, or simulating quantum systems becomes easier, that could be very impactful. If it winds up being the case that it's just much harder to do than we thought, quantum computing might remain a sort of interesting relic for some time to come.
Yeah, we have a long ways to go on it still, but we're having breakthroughs on a regular basis at the same time. So again, we don't know what the insurmountable problem might be somewhere along the way, though. So I want to ask you this question, which is an oddball question. And we had a special science fiction writer as our guest last night. And so this gets back to kind of the origins of data. But the guy that invented the clock, how did he know what time it was?
That's a good question, right? I think solar, lunar, and celestial alignment, but
yeah,
it is sort of it is definitely kind of a.
It's an oddball question, but
an arbitrary layering on a natural process, right? We could have called it something else. We could have measured it in different increments.
Right. Y12. And Y12 twice a day.
That's a really interesting question. What we ought to do is do the edge question scenario, where I forget the guy's name, but he asked Steven Pinker and Sam Harris and all these people the same question, like what's going to change everything. We should just do that with how do you tell what time it is when you're inventing the clock, and then compile that into a book and sell it. This is how 100 top-notch thinkers answered this question that they had no reason to expect would be asked of them. So Jarred, in the 10 or so minutes that we have left, I wanted to get your thoughts about the future of ML ops and machine learning generally. Where do you think the field's going to go? And for a person who wants to get into it or position themselves as an ML ops specialist, what would you recommend?
Yeah, so I'll kind of first say that ML ops is actually just one component of kind of what DataRobot does, because I think there's ultimately kind of three major aspects in this path from data to doing something useful with it. ML ops is the last of those, right? It's how do you ensure that this useful thing you built continues to be useful in the future? And then kind of the front end is how do you get useful data that you can actually find patterns, insights in that, provide some value to you. So kind of, I think there's places for automation in this whole lifetime of data, right? Kind of from its inception at point of being recorded, and then some sort of aggregation, and then all the steps from, okay, now here's this data, there's something useful in it, and then have automation that's going to basically figure out a way to, model that usefulness. So, and then kind of filling in that gap. So if the first third is data, the second third is how do you model this? How do you find the useful signal in this? And then the last third is how do you, get value out of that and continue to get value out of that in the future? So kind of as it relates to where I think the field is going is more and more toward automation. So it started in the simple sense of, hyperparameter grid search for a single model, right? If you're thinking, linear regression, you have, no real parameters that you're adjusting other than the number of kind of variables that you want to model. And then, as you say, you have some sort of a loss function, some sort of optimization function that finds the best coefficients, right? So that's kind of the simplest sense is, well, how many, features should you use? And then you can start getting more and more complex of saying, okay, well, should you try different algorithmic approaches? Should you process your data in different ways? Should you do all these different manipulations? How do you compare the performance of all of these things? How do you find something that's kind of following all these best principles and best practices, and kind of automating that whole process so that it takes the data scientist out of the role of being the human pipetting liquids between trays, which is what I started doing in science, right? Where I'm going to do this experiment. That means I have a kind of, 30 little wells in one tray, and I need to get a precise mixture of, 10 different things into different combinations of those wells to, okay, I want to run an experiment. I want to understand this thing. I'm going to let the automation take care of a lot of what's under the hood, make sure I have everything tweaked and it's doing what I want, and then take that useful thing and do something with it. So I think it's kind of shifting that role of the data scientist away from being kind of the equivalent to the lab monkey toward the one who's thinking about the experiments, thinking about how do I properly conduct this experiment? Okay, I want to answer this thing that's not really obvious from the structure of the data. How can I set things up such that I can get an answer to that, or I can get predictions about that thing? And then understanding what's happening and being able to see what's happening all along the way so that you can trust what's there and it's not just some algorithmic black box that you've built, hooray, and then you don't actually know what it does. And turns out that, in the worst case, it uses this thing that you're legally prohibited from using, right, this feature, and, has all these legal ramifications, or ultimately, you thought you were modeling this thing accurately, it turned out you weren't, and you lost, X number of dollars. So I think it's going more toward having the field is moving more toward having the technical skills you need to interact with kind of complex systems automation and the knowledge of how they work, but much more of kind of a problem framing and kind of utilization deployment side. So building out the edges of that. So you're not just focused on what are the parameters of your model, what's your modeling approach, how do you do your feature engineering. Certainly there's place for you to go in there and kind of add high value adjustment and kind of input, but you don't have to do the basics. It's tuning things and then thinking about where do you want to point this machine at and kind of see what useful things you get. Is that a cohesive answer, coherent answer?
That's a fantastic answer to end the interview. Jarred, thanks very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. That's great.
Thanks for having me, guys.